Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and be invited to this occasion to talk with you about some of my research about the Soviet past, which of course also Georgia was part of. I'm not going to, unfortunately, I have never done any research about, particularly about Georgian Soviet past, so you must excuse me, but I will be very glad to hear your comments about it if you have something to, from your own experience and research, tell me about it, something about those parallel things going on here as well. Now, I will just go tell you a story first. I made one discovery, scientific discovery in my life, and only one. And that's I discovered when Sovietskoye Champanskoye was invented. Soviet champagne was invented. I don't know the exact date, but I know the month and the year. It was 1936 in March, 1936. Then I can imagine, of course we will never know what really happened, how it really went on, what happened. But I can very well imagine, fantasizing more or less as a historical, if I would write a novel of this, I would write it like this, that one night, Stalin, Josip Vissarionovich, Anastas Mikoyan, Sergo Orchonovic, Vyacheslav Voroshilov, and some others probably met as usual at night, having a drinking and eating at night. And then Stalin probably said that, why is it, Anastas, that why aren't people satisfied, workers aren't satisfied? So we have had socialists now already 15, almost 20 years, and still they are complaining and not happy. I said, well, no, really, we have done our best, but not really succeeded with everything, you know, Josip Vissarionovich. But then Stalin, of course, came with the bread, let's give them all champagne. And that's what they did. They gave champagne to the Soviet workers. In April 36, I found in the Moscow archives the first 10-year plan for production of Sovietskoye Champanskoye. It's just one page typed list of figures. It's on one corner with red ink written Udvirstan Anastas Mikoyan, approved Anastas Mikoyan. And it starts from 200,000 bottles a year in 37 and ends up with 20 million bottles, 45. Now, of course, we don't really know what would have happened with all this if the war hadn't broken out. But certainly they did, heroic measures were taken to produce Sovietskoye Champanskoye in great quantities already in the late 30s. It was available at decent prices, at least in some big cities like Moscow and Leningrad, or in the late 30s. And in the after-war periods, it really became very common and popular drink, as you know, everywhere. You can still buy Sovietskoye Champanskoye in Tallinn with the same label, brand. You can't buy anything much of Sovietskoye in Estonia nowadays, but you still can buy Sovietskoye Champanskoye. I heard you can buy it even here. So it really became a kind of a Soviet Coca-Cola, and a symbol of the good life of Soviet society. In the same way as the real thing, Coca-Cola is the symbol of the good American life. And it was produced in enormous, quite big quantities, and you could buy it in many places in those days, in the 60s and 70s, and even afterwards. Now, it's, of course, quite strange in many ways why had anyone thought of producing Sovietskoye Champanskoye, champagne to the workers in 36. As we know, this was the time when the second 5-year plan had just started a bit late, a year or two late, but recently. This was not part of the 5-year plan, it was probably the middle of the 5-year plan, second 5-year plan. This was the time when the forced collectivization had taken place with millions of dead people and starving people. This was just 2 years later when the system of rationing of the basic food items had stopped in 33-4. Everything was rationed until you had to have cars to buy the most simple things, sugar was one of the last ones, of course, that you had to have rationing cards to buy. And it was the time, of course, when the first 5-year plan had recently stopped, and all the efforts and even investments had gone to the heavy industry, it was called in those times. There was hardly anything done of the kind of a light industry or food production or so forth. So this was not, certainly Savetsko Shambatska was not the only item that was produced in the middle of this mostly starving country in those days, but then, so to say, it's an enormous contrast in the sense that of course after here. But that was not the only thing, there were other things as well. That was the time when Armянский cognac became what it later was known to be, that kind of also very valuable drink in the Soviet Union. Confetti, chocolate and confetti, as we know the standard assortment of chocolate and confetti produced in Soviet times. That started as well in those days. Torti, Kievski, Torti, Takdalevski, all these cherished items of Soviet past still, they all were introduced in 35, 36, something like those. It was also the time when for the first time, regular shops were opened after the net period. I mean, there were no, in the Soviet Union, there were no ordinary shops at all in the late 20s and early 30s. There were no shops where you would go if you had money and buy things with your money, or hardly any. Everything was distributed by rationing systems or through some other distribution channels, mainly through your workplace. You got all your provisioning through your workplace. And it was a highly hierarchical system where those workplaces that were regarded to be the priorities, heavy industry or electricity or whatever, railways and so forth, they were relatively better provided, whereas some others were not very well provided. And of course, countryside was worse in many ways. So this was called shortly after the collectivization, which really people were starving everywhere. And there were still long queues for everything in Moscow, and you had to, even in Moscow in those days, it was just an absolute, there was hardly anything at all. And there were no restaurants that would be open at all. There were no cafes. There were not ordinary hotels at all. But these all were open in the mid-30s, in a very short period of time. A kind of basic, also sausages and better sausages and cheese was then started producing great quantities, some canned food as well and things like that. Was really the time when everything seemed to change in a sense, in a very short time, a couple of years of time. And we know from also other sources that there was a drastic change in the official cultural policy of the country, including that cultural consumption. We know, for instance, that at this very time, for instance, in Komsomol groups, people could be seriously questioning that politics were changing very rapidly, as we know, and it was difficult to know what was the correct line. And young people would be seriously asking their Komsomol leaders, Tavarish, is it really right now to wear a suit and a necktie? And isn't it a sign of being a bourgeois counter-revolutionary to be wearing like this? And now it was right. It was not only right, but it was also, so to say, a positive sign. It was recommended. One should be dressed like a gentleman, more or less. Every worker should be dressed like that on evenings out on a theatre or something like that. This was often also the year when Pushkin became what it became. Kind of a real Soviet or Russian national, or Soviet national poet, literary hero. Pushkin was forbidden more or less until that. It was dangerous petty bourgeois literature. Now they celebrated Pushkin's 150th birthday, I guess, was celebrated in 99. So it was, for instance, that's also a sign of the science. Now that kind of Russian classical literature, theatre, music and things like that had been in the late 30s and early 30s, they have been dangerous, anti-revolutionary, anti-Soviet ideology presented, they become cherished objects that every cultured, educated Soviet person should know and become like this. They call it, the kulturnos, this was finally when you should become cultured again. And it was also that time when some Bivshie were rehabilitated and they were needed taken into work again. I mean, all professionals, for instance, were rehabilitated, they taken into work again. And of course, 1936 was the year of Stalin's constitution. And it was the year when Stalin had the famous slogan, "Life has become better, comrades, life has become more joyous." And what would be a better proof of that than champagne spray to everyone? And confetti and cognac and even some Gruzinski vina, but that was not so important issue in those days, but for some reason it might have been more difficult to produce it. But these were all things that you could produce in mass scale in industrial. And one doesn't have to be a very fine cultural analyst to be able to interpret what this all was meant to mean. This was, of course, that kind of copies of consumer goods and items that had kind of an aura of former aristocracy. They was the kind of luxuries of the past. And they were now given to the workers as well. Or at least the promise that you will have this very soon. You will have everything. You will have opera, champagne, and of course caviar was part of this also. You can caviar, you can have caviar. The canned system of this can that we know from Soviet times, this was introduced also in those days. The famous tin can, which is labeled, is from the very same time as well. They are very, this way because they were very, sometimes one doesn't know whether we should laugh or cry when you read these stories and archives, look at the archives, because they had great problems with these tin cans that were produced in Astrahan in great quantities that were, again, of course they belong together with champagne, torti and caviar and things like that. It was difficult to keep them, to pack them, you had to somehow keep them not knocking at each other. So they used rubber bands from bicycle tires. They cut them into small pieces and put them around these cans when they packed them, so they would keep from not knocking from each other. Must have been a huge job to do, but that's just a detail. Anyway, this was of course the time that something seemed to be changing. Many historians who have been studying other fields than this kind of a small field of which I call common luxuries or something of Soviet times. Of course, these were not real luxuries. They were not real luxuries. Caviar was real caviar, of course. Champagne was, of course, not real champagne. It was sparkling wine, produced in a new industrial way. There was a famous professor, Frolov Bagrayev, who was the father of Sovietskoye Champanskoye, obviously viticulturalist, chemist as well, who was very eagerly promoting these new ways of producing champagne. He said that, of course, industrial method is much better than the old way, that we get much better champagne this way. It's not at all cheap, but it's much better, standardized and good and so forth. It was also fitted very well into the new industrialization, and everything that's big, industrial, standardized, big and so forth is good. And well, there's even one, I can't resist telling one more story. Anastasius Mikoyan was the one who was mainly responsible for all this, because he was the Narodny Komissar Pishova Provisions in those days, the People's Commissariat of Food Industry. Later he was even, a long career, a very famous career, became the president and so forth, but he was the guy who was responsible for all this food industry. He was very active in doing all this, obviously. He made a 1 month tour in the United States, also in 1936. He obviously visited all possible factories, or food factories in the United States. And it was more industrial espionage, but it was done in a diplomatic basis, so to say. And he was very enthusiastic about we should do everything like here. It was fitted in the idea that we have, America was the country of the Ford, of industrial mass-produced products, and we could do the same in food industry to solve our problems, to give the standardized good, decent products, cheap products to masses. And that's what Mikoja was so enthusiastic about. Everything was fine. He went even to the department store, Macy's, and wrote a long report about Macy's, how everything is done, in very detailed report about every small detail, how things were, how cash machines worked there and so forth. Everything was wonderful and nice in New York in 1936. And Mikoja, the first, this juicy sock, which you had everyone in the Soviet Union. In the shops, you had this special glass decanters, which they are Mikoja's brought them from the States. So tomato sock and others. He wrote enthusiastically that socks are this juice are very good, they're very nourishing and vitamins and so forth. We should have them as well. And so he did. They were available everywhere in the Soviet Union, in all ordinary shops. But he also brought, you couldn't guess what he also brought from the States. Hamburger kiosks. He bought hamburger kiosks from New York with him. And it was ideal, so he wrote a long report there on hamburger kiosks as well. Ideal solution, of course. Safe, hygienic, nutritional value, good and everything. It's a perfect solution, very fast. A working man can take a hamburger on his way to job and so forth, eat in there on the street, and it has everything, meat and vegetables and bread and everything is there, and it can be produced in 1.5 minutes, it's ready and so forth. And they opened in Moscow just before the war. There at least was one hamburger kiosk in Moscow. I don't know if it really worked, but there are pictures of it that there was advertised in Moscow. I think it was in this exhibition for agriculture, Plastishenia, the famous exhibition area in those days. Well, then of course war broke out and those were forgotten. Hamburgers were forgotten, like many other things were forgotten after the war. And then of course the Cold War broke out and some of these American things were not so good anymore. They were imperialist stuff later on, but who knows, if the war hadn't broken out, we might have a Mikojan chain of hamburgers nowadays all over the world. Anyway, that's just one story, but it's of course interesting to explain why this happened. Why of course this was in the third case in particular, these things were not available everywhere. There was shortage. It's mainly Moscow. Everything was like it was also, Moscow was the real showcase. This was of course the opening of the metro lines were opened, then with the palaces for the people, the metro stations, palaces for the people, and everything was there. And people, about 70% of all consumer goods in many fields were sold in Moscow only, which Moscow had about 2 million people of all the 160 million in the whole country, so it was very centralized, of course, and somewhere in Leningrad, some in Kiev, some more things might be available in Tbilisi, even I don't know, but still, of course, this was not available to all the workers of the Soviet Union in practice and so, but still, it was a picture that was given, it was a new idea world. That's what we want to do, this is what we want you to show you. This is already in Moscow, soon you will also have it, and so forth. And it's very strange, of course, to think about in many ways why such a stress, even if you think about this, that is kind of had this aura, aristocratic luxuries, you know, cheap copies of kitsch, even also, if you like, but still, as the luxuries. But there are, of course, some good explanations why we don't know really. There's no protocols of what went on in the central. We don't. Well, there might be, but they are not open about the Central Committee or Politburo, whether they discuss these matters of the new lines policy or new lines of cultural policy and so forth. But one reasonable interpretation is that this was a time when appeared a new kind of a Soviet which could be middle class, which of course is very dubious to call it middle class, but Soviet intelligentsia. It was educated people, urban educated people, that were educated in the new Soviet institutions, universities and technicum and so forth, engineers, doctors of medicine, teachers, university teachers, and of course even party apparatchik, party bureaucrats and party, not ordinary level, not the high level, but everyone. who obviously were kind of needed some kind of new standards, so to say, urban, decent living, and something to be enjoyed and have something to be rewarded with something that they could feel that that's something worth getting at with. And this was of course the time when also the time of the Staharevich movement, when the wage differences became huge in the Soviet Union. Some workers could earn a lot in rubles, a lot of money. 1,000 rubles when the average wage was only 80 rubles or something like that. There were not so many cases, but there were some. There were thousands of people anyway in Moscow, of course, more and more, who had money now. But there was nothing to buy with money. So this was, of course, kind of in a way, easy way to try to invent something that those workers and expert specialists could use their money for, at least to somehow get a decent, better life and things like that. And in a rather, it didn't demand all that. Instead of building new apartments for everyone, which would have been extremely expensive, of course, and take a lot of time and so forth, this was kind of with small, that kind of symbolic gestures, more or less, they're doing it. So that's probably what is behind this. So it was kind of a new Soviet kulturnost was emerging, was created in those years, which included some kind of high culture, classical light high culture, admiration, with things belonging to it like champagne and caviar and confetti, good dinners, even restaurants, 3-course dinners, and in a nice restaurant. Moskva, the big Moscow hotel complex was opened in '39, just before the war as well, which was a real showpiece of this kind of new. It had everything. It had snack bars, it had 3 restaurants, it had dance halls, music, orchestras playing, and of course this was time when tango was obligatory for all the Soviet military personnel. They had to learn dancing tango. Tango was of course the fashionable dance of the Turkish in the German style tango, not Argentina. March style tango, which is still popular in Finland nowadays. It's more like national music. Anyway, so this is kind of in the middle of all this poverty and almost long queues and starvations and things like that, shortages, deficit and so forth, which was daily life for many people. Living conditions were very poor. People were living in apartments. Housing situation was terrible. Hardly any houses were built in the 30s at all, new houses. They just distributed old houses between. And the urban population increased hugely in those years. There were millions and millions of people coming to Moscow and other big cities. And there were hardly any houses built at all. They all just had to get in the old ones. But there was at least something. There was something to be proud of, something to be nice things that we could enjoy. Of course, the Gorky Park was opened also a bit later, earlier, it was the Kulttuuri, which became open everywhere in all the cities, so amusement parks with the emphasis on culture. It was not only entertainment, it was also Kultúra that was part of these parks, and so forth. So there are many sites, but it happened in a very, very short time, and in many ways one would say that, of course then war broke out, but in many ways one would say that some of the basics of the Soviet culture of consumption were created in those very short time years before the war, which were then re-established and opened again in the late 40s and 50s. As we know, the Soviet Union more or less recovered from the war, first in the mid-50s. The standards of pre-war standards, which were very low, of course, even the pre-war standards, they were reached sometimes in 55 or something like that. And then 55 to 70 or something like that was rather a good time in the Soviet Union. Economic growth, even consumer good industry was doing quite well and so forth. I think those were the most optimistic times in the history of the Soviet Union, where there was many people obviously believed that we can make it, we can reach America, if not quite like Russia said, but anyway, we can almost reach it and so forth. And it looked a bit like the new houses were built for people, for Khrushchev, as you know, in the Russian times and so forth. But all this Soviet infrastructure, you know, this gastronom bacalaia shops, which were everywhere, They were founded in mid-30s, and they were preserved. Department stores, Zoom was opened first in 56, I guess, but Zoom was opened in 30s in Moscow, Central Univermal. And similar department stores were opened in all. There were no department stores in Russia at all before that, hardly any at all. There were bazaar, and they were closed after that, they were mostly closed everything. There was nothing. And the kind of finer restaurants and cafes, first-class restaurants, National, Metropole were reopened, Moskva, of course, and so forth. So it's a kind of things, and these all became part of the Soviet system, cultural consumption, so the ideal or the good life consumption which remained more or less as that until the very end of the Soviet Union. 70s, even 80s, they were all there. With Champagne as well, Soviet Champagne. There were basically two types, palusuhu and paluslatkuja. Demi-sec or half sweet. The half sweet was of course for women and half dry for men, so there was a division of gender there as well. Anyway, now I would like to, of course, that was not everything. Even after the war, things of course did get better, and even in the more, I would say, in a more serious way, living standards were getting better. Not only that way that we could occasionally have a glass of champagne and a sandwich of caviar after theatre, but even in more serious ways that you could dream of getting a better apartment. You would be more or less sure that you could have something to eat every day without long queues and things like that. And so basic things were available, even though we know that until the very late there were serious shortages in many areas, and even in some areas people were still queuing for basic foodstuffs quite late in Soviet times. So and that's another story why that was so. What other shortages where there were queues and what was that which led to all kinds of black markets and things like which we all know and hear about. I don't have time to talk about that. That's the more general story that you probably also know yourself. But I want to take this a bit other side of the picture up here. Now there's another very amazing thing that I came across in some of my archival studies in Moscow. In the middle of the war, in 1944, in the beginning of 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party made a decision to open a fashion house in Moscow. And that was just half a year after Stalingrad. There was still 1.5 years to Berlin. And what does the Central Committee discuss and decide? To open a fashion house in Moscow. And they did open a fashion house in Moscow in 1944. They opened one. And this was the famous Moskovsky Dom Manilei, Moscow Fashion House, which later became the All-Union Fashion House, Cesarewski Dom Manilei. Already in the late 40s it was renamed. And these fashion houses were then, even during the last years, with Leningrad, and was almost immediately after the blockade was over. There was the famous fashion house on Nevsky Prospect, at the corner of the Bolshoi Maneshnya, which was Leningradsky Dom Manilei. And they opened in every republic, capital of republic, they opened fashion houses. They were every big city. There was Stalinsky Dom Manilei, there was Tbilisky Dom Manilei, Yerevansky Dom Manilei, there was Vilnius fashion house, and there was Novosibirsk and Vladivostok and so forth. By the end of the 50s, these were all open fashion houses. And their main task was to design fashionable new clothes to the textile industry, the clothes industry. But they also had other tasks. They also designed clothes for individual sewing. They published journals and albums or patterns of fashionable clothing. They organized fashion shows all the time. They had ateliers, not everyone, but sometimes they had ateliers attached to it where people could go and order things to be issued by them using these new fashionable patterns and so forth and so forth. That was everywhere in the sense that it was and that was not. Now we can again ask why did anyone in the middle of the war think of central committee or anyway meeting and having it? It was not just some guys in ministries or something like that having a meeting and discussing the opening fashion houses. But I can also think, of course, we don't know. We don't have protocols again. We don't know.